delighted to be here to speak on behalf of Microsoft in Tallinn. And I heard what was said about friends and making new friends. I would like to think that Microsoft is an old and trusted friend of Estonia, so I'm delighted to be back and discuss what we do. So what I'm intending to discuss really is how we've seen the cyber threat landscape develop over the last year, particularly as we've seen a lot of AI introduced into the digital domain. And really, the cyber threat landscape has continued to be more complex and dangerous, which has really reinforced the need to harden our digital domains, protect our networks, protect our data, but equally, as you'll begin to hear, protect our people at all levels. Because attacks are taking place at breathtaking speeds. The agility and speed of technology development that we've seen, particularly with the introduction of generative AI, has meant also that the attacks that we've been facing and the need for the defenders and the pace of change for the defenders is equally as fast. Just alone in the United States, last year, 389 healthcare institutions were subject to successful ransomware attacks. We've seen influences also on elections and how people are trying to interfere with them. And really the big change we've seen this year is a convergence. The convergence of nation-state attacks with cybercrime and how they're beginning to use hackathons and state-sponsored capabilities even more and more to be going forward. Because what we see is this complex, challenging, and increasingly dangerous development in cyberspace that requires, as we go forward at the frontier of an AI-empowered world, how do we leverage AI more efficiently in this tug of war between the attacker and the defender? We face a series of challenges. For Microsoft in itself, with our customers, we're seeing and defending against around 600 million attacks every day as we go forward. And how do we meet the challenge and focus from committing from users to executive level? How do you think about that security culture? How are we developing? And also, how we discuss with our governments around the world that we're dealing with, what about the consequences? Because it's not just about dealing with it from a defender and a technical perspective. What are the consequences that we can deal with to take forward? Because actually, for us, it's all hands on deck. Even as Microsoft, we've come under attacks as well. And therefore, how do we approach and keep developing and going forward? And we've developed things called the Secure Future Initiative, where actually everything is secure by design, secure by default, and secure operations. And it's the last one that's been fairly substantial changes. How do we ensure these operations are changes the day-to-day business for us and our customers going forward? Because as our CEO says, it's a consequential time, and we need to get it right. But Microsoft is in an advantage of being quite a unique advantage point to be able to take things forward. And an increase of about 13% in the signals that we've been dealing with across our networks last year. 78 trillion signals a day being dealt with. That needs AI and ML capabilities to be able to analyze from endpoints, tech partner systems with sophisticated AI tools to be able to see and try and spot where we're going. Over 1,500 unique groups are facing off. Around 600 of those are from state-nation attackers. 300 cybercrime, but also growing more and more, 200 in the influence space. How about propaganda campaigns, how they're trying to produce false news going forward, and then a series of others as well. And it's really that state-nation activity, as you see forward, is going around the emerging threat areas, and the specific areas of everything from supply chains all the way to how we deal with addressing faults in technical debt. And really that becomes the access point where some people have not guarded all their systems, and how do people find their way going forward and trying to break in. And you can see from Microsoft's approach some of the stuff that we've had to do in the middle purple box about how do we create incident responses in light of a new AI world. And to do that, Microsoft has invested a lot to increase the number of security. If you had seen this presentation last year talking about our positioning, we would have said 10,000. We now have 34,000 full-time employees focused on security. Such is the importance and the priority that we place on it. And it is Microsoft's #1 priority going forward. But what are we seeing? actually, state-nation threats, activities are increasing as you go forward. And we're seeing this more and more, and particularly in the education, research, and under that, I would also say, in the non-profit organizations. We're seeing the threats and the attacks happening there. And really, when you look at it from the education side, what we're also seeing is invariably, that's where people are testing their capabilities in that environment before they deploy them elsewhere. So it may not be specifically just targeting for the education sector, but how do they test the tools and the capabilities they have to then follow them on attacks on governments and other parts of the commercial sector going forward. And when you look at it, for really where we end up in the Station 8 activity, I appreciate it's maybe a bit small there, but if you look at the United States on the left-hand side and the number of attacks they're facing, and then Israel, Ukraine, Taiwan, obviously with the geopolitics and the conflicts around the world, you can see why those are quite large. But in comparison, the scale of those attacks compared to the US is speaking of its own importance of how they need to address them in those specific countries. And whilst it tails off in the other areas of the other countries, there's still significant attacks there. And therefore, from what we're seeing from our data, there is some amount of attacks and the reinforcement for everybody's responsibility, not just those in conflicts going forward. But in those attacks also, I go back to the point that actually we're seeing a lot on the influence campaigns and how people are thinking about trying to shape, be it elections or people's opinions, or particularly in the conflicts that are going on, again, more how do they try and shape the influence that they have in those campaigns. And Microsoft is delighted to be supporting Ukraine in its conflict and helping them with their cybersecurity efforts. And if you haven't heard that story, maybe it's one you speak to our local teams about, because we would be delighted to tell you how we've helped and what the lessons that can be learned from that. But yet again, the biggest trend and insights we're seeing is against ransomware. Year-on-year growth, 2.75 times year-on-year is the increase in ransomware attacks that we've seen. And these are human-generated capabilities going forward. But what we have seen is in the last 2 years, a decrease of 3 times how much they've been successful. And therefore, where people have been able to do automated attack disruption, then actually that's had a successful impact against what's been posed by ransomware. However, they are still getting through. And 92% of those attacks that happen are generally because there's been some sort of unmanaged system. And therefore, when people think about zero trust architecture, are you actually enrolling a capability or an endpoint onto the system, or are you blocking it? And if you're not, or you don't know where they all are, that is where we're seeing ransomware attacks coming through and the successful ones of them. But as I said, a big decrease in the amount of attacks that are now being successful because of the architectural posture that people are changing and how they're managing their devices and their identity through multi-factor authentication as well as we go forward. So what happens now? If they're not doing it that way, well, as we go for multi-factor authentication, zero trust architectures, then actually the attacks that we're seeing are through identity. And this is where the biggest sophistication is done. No longer really is it password-only attacks. With multi-factor authentication, then actually a lot of people are being able to block this capability going forward. But what we are seeing, that when they think about the identity capabilities, is actually they're trying to get in through legitimate means. So they're using AI and generative AI to think about how they can get people's identity, how they can maybe tease them into giving some of the information over, and then trying to take a device and authorize it against somebody's identity. So how can you do what we call SIM swapping and get that device done? So they're attacking the infrastructure, they're bypassing how we think about authentication, and also going in at the application level. And by taking that over, then actually what they're trying to do is then represent themselves and create what we call adversary in the middle, particularly phishing. And what we've seen in adversary in the middle phishing capabilities, an increase this year of 146%. That's why training and the people and protecting the people in education is a priority that we put on board to go forward. Because actually, if we don't think about it, then actually what's happening is really, in some cases, what we've seen is people aren't doing the right controls in place. They're not thinking about how they deal with particularly the application layer, and therefore, when we're dealing with it, how are they discussing their privileges as well? So not only is it multi-factor authentication, but also if they do get into the identity, how do you think about reducing what access they have through a zero trust architecture approach as we go forward? And we've also seen through our security exposure management team, how do we think differently? Yeah? How do we think of how AI is going to be used? Yeah? And the visibility, instead of thinking about this in silos now, is very much about how we think about it in potential attack paths. What is the route they're using to get in? How can they move across? And therefore, what is required to be able to look at, and how do you monitor your systems? And as you can see, it's quite low. Only 10% of attack paths have 3 steps or less. Many of them have a lot more. And therefore, as we go forward, what we're seeing in the governments and industries is the need to have that single pane of glass, end-to-end. The ability to monitor your networks going forward. How do we think about critical asset protection? How do we think about attack path management? And where do we go in the terms of end-to-end visibility to reduce their access and go forward? This has changed a lot of postures in many countries as we go forward in how they think about their applications. And many people are going for lots of applications, maybe up to 80 or so applications in security, but not actually working out where the overlaps and gaps were. And therefore, very much introducing a single pane of glass, or how do you do an integrated security approach end-to-end is where we're going. And that approach has also seen an increase in value of return of investment to get more security without paying as much for maybe some of the applications going forward. So we've seen a big change as people look at how they do their SOCs and also their NOCs going forward. Because it is changing, and AI in the hands of the attackers is changing things. When you look at just these 2 examples, generative AI being used to do better search, better research into people, to make sure that spear phishing to get those identities or whale phishing for high priority targets is how do they address them and go forward. We're seeing a lot more of that dedicated targeting attacks against people going forward. But I think when you look to the future and some of the emerging ones, how AI is being used as a force multiplier by some of the agents that we face, is when you look at what they're trying to do with things like resume swarming. How do they get maybe an insider into an organization by writing using AI to write the CV response and help people get into a position? Or swarm with a lot of credibility to block the decision process and slow people down in hiring, etc., going forward. We're seeing that more and more, equally how they're asking people to upload things and embed. It just gives you an idea of the change in the market space and what it means for people, particularly in the HR world going forward. But I suppose I would like to really close on, if we're going to deal with this, it is a more dynamic environment. We are seeing increased cybersecurity. We are seeing them demand needed. We are seeing the attackers using AI and trying to get into those vulnerabilities with the focus on identity. But this, as I said at the beginning, will not be solved by tech alone. It requires a combination of geopolitical solutions as well. And deterrence can be done by denying intrusion, but how do you impose consequences? And a lot of the work we're discussing with governments and agencies is how do you impose that consequence? Because it requires governments to enforce international roles and impose those deterrent consequences as we go forward, to ensure then that we have responsible AI practices and that people use it for AI as a force for good. Thank you very much for letting me come and speak to you today. It's what Microsoft's seeing through our Secure Future initiative. We're very keen to help, and we continue to our partners to ensure we deliver secure by design, secure by default, and secure operations for all our customers. Thank you.